The word of the week this week is a fun German word it can be intimidating to pronounce because it doesn't look like it doesn't look like an English word at all, but it's not that bad. It's Aufheben. It's quite it's phonetic. Lots of German stuff is very phonetic, so it's Aufheben. And I'm not expecting people to necessarily use the word all the time. It's a good word to have in your mind and to think about, which when you think of stuff in your mind, you don't need to pronounce it. You just kind of know it, which is cool. But Aufheben is a really cool word that has a meaning that can seem quite contradictory, but the fact that it's not a contradiction makes it even better. And so with Aufheben, the word means to preserve, to destroy, and to transcend. And there's a whole bunch of other words in there, like other words that could mean preserve or could mean destroy. Those are also, loosely translated as Aufheben because it doesn't have an English translation. And so the word Aufheben, preserve, destroy, transcend, it seems contradictory, but it's not, because it's in fact just what you do in life. That's just what we do all the time, and it's a key part of the dialectic. And the dialectic is just conversations you have to find truth in society. And so with the dialectic and Aufheben, if we look at it from a Hegelian way, like Friedrich Hegel, this George William Friedrich Hegel, this German philosopher, you get to see that he had a thesis and an antithesis. The thesis was the status quo, and the antithesis is whatever was created to challenge it at the time. And instead of he feeling in his dialectic that either the thesis or the antithesis would prevail, what would happen is that they would have a synthesis and create something new. And the verb for the action of synthesizing is Aufheben. And so by this word, what you're doing is you're preserving and destroying parts of the thesis. And you're preserving and destroying parts of the antithesis. And by doing that, you'll create something new that should transcend both the thesis and the antithesis. This is the goal. Clearly, that's not always the outcome, but that's the goal. And so in life, I think at a micro level, like a person-to-person level, we engage in Aufheben all the time. Like every time you're in a relationship, the idea is for like the person that you're in that relationship with, for them to make you better, where you are better as a person with that other person than you would be without them. And for that to be reciprocated, where that person is a better person because they're with you. And then collectively, now you're two better manifestations of yourself, and the sum is greater than its parts. That's an Aufheben. You are transcending your separate thesis and antithesis. And the goal with bringing kids into the world is the idea that like they are literally like a biological manifestation of Aufheben. And so we can look at it at a micro level. But the thing that's really fascinating with Hegel and his dialectic and Aufheben is that he wanted it to work at a macro level, where instead of it being a conversation between one or two people, we're having a conversation between thousands and millions of people, where there's like a social thesis that's like the status quo of a society, and it's being challenged. And so in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was the French Revolution, and one of the big things in that revolution for Hegel was the capacity for Aufheben to occur, where it wasn't that the monarchs were going to prevail or that the peasants were going to prevail. It was going to be that something new that France had never seen before would emerge. And for Hegel, the embodiment of Aufheben was Napoleon, because he was not a monarch and he was not a commoner, but he was also kind of both. He was a hybrid of the two, and he ruled France in a way that France had never been ruled before. Now, this doesn't mean that Napoleon was a perfect person. That's not the point. It's just that a synthesis of the two is what became the new result. And once you create a synthesis, once Aufheben happens and you have a synthesis, that synthesis becomes the new thesis. And then there's going to be a new antithesis. And this process will continue and continue. And it's a process of constantly engaging at micro and macro levels to find truth. And so I've been thinking about this word Aufheben quite a bit in response to George Floyd. We have an American status quo that gives people ample reasons to rebel and want to create something better, create something that transcends that status quo. And with revolutions, the goal of revolutions is not merely to topple who's in charge. Like, those are more so like coup d'etats, where the goal is just somebody else is going to, take over because they think the current person is not good at their job and they're going to use brute force. Revolutions are trying to transcend the norm. And so I think what's happening right now is American society is trying to transcend what has long been our ethnocidal norm. And as we engage in this process, there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. And this is, if you look at it via like a Hegelian dialectic, that's just what should happen. Like, there's going to be tension, there's going to be conflict. But if you understand that the end goal is transcendence, Aufheben, a synthesis, then it's much easier to understand what people are trying to do. I think it's really hard in English for people to see this transcendence because we just don't have a word for Aufheben in our language. We have words like assimilation, where one faction gets absorbed into another, but we don't have a language to transcend the norm. And it's something to think about a lot. Like, why didn't English, or American English in particular, feel the need to create these words? We've always projected America as being like a utopian place that's perfect and God made it. And so if you think like that, then you won't be necessarily, there won't be a big emphasis on trying to transcend something you think God gave you. So maybe that's one of the major impediments why we don't have that word. But as we engage in this revolutionary action nowadays, we need the word Aufheben and understand that the goal is transcendence and a synthesis that's better than what was before. And so that's, it's Aufheben is like a word that describes both life and revolutions, and I think that's just quite profound and beautiful. And so if Jackie, if you have any questions, I will gladly answer any questions you may have about the word. But yeah, that's our word of the week. All right, so that's a great question. The thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the George Floyd movement. So clearly the thesis is like the American status quo. Now, the complex part about it is I don't think America has spent a lot of time naming what that status quo is. At the Sustainable Culture Lab at SCL, we describe that as ethnocide. Like, we live in an ethnocidal society that's based on destroying people's culture and profiting off of that culture, and it's very, very problematic. And you can see that George Floyd's death, and I wrote a piece about this. I wrote a couple pieces about it actually, but I wrote one for the Daily Beast and another for the BBC, and it's how ethnocide is what killed George Floyd. And so I think our status quo is trying to get to liberate ourselves from ethnocidal oppression. And so the antithesis is clearly the people that don't want to be subjugated and exploited under ethnocide. Now, the question here, and this is the big question, and this is also where, like, the French Revolution is a great example, is when you're trying to make something that transcends the present situation, you have to make new language for that, because you need, if you haven't, if a type of state of existence hasn't existed, then there won't be a bunch of words to describe it. So you have to start creating new words to describe what the synthesis should be called, and how do you continue that synthesis. And so you either create new words, or you find words from the past that you think apply to the situation you're trying to create. And so, like, right now, and like France is a very good example, because they had the status quo in France was what we now call the ancient regime, or the ancien regime. And it was, it was feudalism. It was a monarchy that controlled everything, and there were people who were peasants and serfs, and they were subjects of the king. They weren't citizens. They were subjects. And so the thesis were the monarchs that liked the status quo, and the antithesis were the common folk who did not like it. Now, at the end, if there's a synthesis, you have to say what's going to be the thing that gets made. And so the common people of France started using the language of the Greeks to talk about democracy, talk about citizens, to talk about republics, and this is what they wanted to have. And so that new language gave them the rallying cries that they needed to, and the confidence to say, when we get rid of the monarchy, we can make a new thing, and this new thing will have a mixture of the stuff that we think is good. Parts of everything will get preserved and destroyed. And so with George Floyd, the synthesis, like, if we use SCL's language, there's going to be a lot of words that are going to come out of the synthesis. I think a key word, without a doubt, is evtopia. Like, you would, instead of living in a place that's ethnocidal, you'll live in a place that's evtopian, which is a good place. That's something that can transcend our current norm, where we would say that's dystopian. And so this would be like a transcendent way of looking at things. That's a synthesis, because the evtopian space that we will have will clearly take parts from all parts of the thesis and the antithesis to make something that's better than the present. At the same time, like, we have a big cultural void in our society because it's ethnocidal, so there's going to be new cultural identifiers that people are going to need to come up with. At SCL, we think the word Fricano is another word that could be very powerful for articulating the culture, the equitable culture of people in the U.S. as they have liberated themselves from ethnocidal oppression. And so yeah, and like right now, I think the antithesis, if the antithesis had to have a name, like, that name would be like Black Lives Matter. I think that's the rallying cry of the antithesis. Now, the end result could be something that transcends Black Lives Matter and transcends the ethnocidal society that we live in. And that could be Evtopian, it could be Fricano, it could also just remain and just be called Black Lives Matter. It's hard to say, but the key thing is that there's going to be new language that will be created, and you have to understand the process that will occur, and that process will be Aufheben. So that's that. Any other questions, Jackie? Okay. All right, well, looks like we had a pretty good one today. Here we go. Let's see. How do we know that the synthesis that we make is good in the case of Napoleon? Oh, that's a good question. That is a good question. So the thing is so I guess you have to start thinking about what good means. So there's subjectives and objective goods. And so, like, a subjective good is like how you feel about something in many ways. It's like your taste. Like something tastes good, you like it. That's for the most part that's subjective. But something that is good in an objective way is something that's sustainable. And the French Revolution was a really good example, because they tried a whole bunch of other things that were better than the ancient regime, but they didn't figure out how to make them sustainable. Napoleon gets celebrated because he was kind of like the first stable person that he stabilized France. After the after the revolution, or during the revolution, there was a lot of death happening. Robespierre came in, and that was bad because it was not sustainable, and clearly killing people is quite bad. And so, knowing something's good in many ways depends on the stability of it, and if you can keep that stability while being relatively peaceful. Like the U.S., we've articulated the U.S. as being good due to like its stability, but a lot of that stability is due to like persistent, rampant terrorism of non-white people, and clearly the geography of the U.S. is makes it easier to be stable because we don't have like threats. But now we look at climate change and all the stuff that we've been building as we thought we were stable, and it's like that's clearly not sustainable. So the synthesis that you make is good based on how sustainable you feel it can be. Like the structures that support it, the quality that's documented, the philosophy that exist. And like Europe's a really fascinating example because up until like World War II, they didn't, until after World War II, they hadn't figured out a structure that was sustainable. France had a whole bunch of governments between the end of the revolution, or the start of the revolution, to the end of World War II. And since then, since World War II, they've had like one government. And a lot of European countries kind of have a similar trajectory where they had a lot of instability as they tried to figure out something that was better than just a concentration of power amongst monarchs and subjugation of the majority of the population. So a lot of trial and error. And so the synthesis you make might not be sustainable, but it could still be better than the oppressive structure before. But that's also like the beauty of the dialectic, is if you make a synthesis, it just becomes a thesis. And now everyone's encouraged to have an antithesis that challenges it. And that challenge, can be quite peaceful. It could be volatile. But if the thesis is something that's unsustainable, this has a lot of holes in it, isn't sound, then the thesis will clearly result in the need to transcend the inadequacies of that. But if you have something that's pretty stable and sustainable, it'll be harder to, it will be less necessary to transcend it. So yeah, so it's so you don't know, but you do know that you need to try to make something better. So like no one knows the outcome of actions, but you have to act in a way that you're confident can make things better. Does Aufheben require a leader to lead the charge? Like, yes and no. I guess one of those questions is like, who is a leader? Like, there's definitely gonna always be someone who is like the face that's in the front of something, but there's clearly gonna be other people that are behind the scenes that play roles that are less celebrated, that are also leading the movement or leading the charges. So like, yes, and no. Like philosophically, like right now, if you look at Black Lives Matter, following George Floyd, I don't think anyone would say that there's one precise leader of all of this, but you would say that there's a philosophy of combating ethnocide in America that makes it really easy for people to follow the lead of that idea. And from that, There may emerge to be like a person or people who are the leaders, but it's not essential that there's a leader. I think right now, if you just look around, we're talking so much about the many, many people that are participating that are just regular everyday people that they're getting information from, social media and websites and all sorts of stuff. And someone definitely took the lead to um, so multiple groups of people define what is a sustainable synthesis. Um, we'll stay. So yes, but we'll stay with like the democracy example. So like right now, I believe that a lot, the fact that this is an election year makes it so that it's easy for people at an individual level to see how long they need to like stay focused. I think there's clearly a goal of doing these efforts and hoping that they result in Trump leaving the White House. And that, that calendar essentially makes it so that you don't need to have someone clarify the importance of this to change society. Like, the outrage that everybody has is a motive, and normally you will need a leader to focus people beyond just their emotional outrage, get them to show up and consistently work together. With social media, you can see that it's easier to disseminate information without there being like a clear leader who's like preaching from the bully pulpit. But at the same time, like our democratic structure, our calendar is making it almost like that serves as the leader right now, where we all know if we keep these topics in the news and people keep on going to the streets, and we sustain this through November, it could result in drastic changes at every level of our society based on who gets elected and who doesn't. And so that kind of serves as like a leader right now. And so I guess I'd say one thing that is significant is if you compare this to the civil rights struggle of the 60s, like right now we talk about the civil rights struggle almost as if it was like a organized, an abundantly organized endeavor with like, one or two leaders here, like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. But at the time, there were so many different groups not vying for like leadership, but articulating how American racism was such a problem. And those groups would then meet together, and the respective leaders of this group and that group, they would meet together and they'd organize their people. And so even then, our closest example prior to social media and disseminating information like we have now, there was a slew of leaders. And if that ended up, potentially could result in someone being the main one, but it clearly has a grassroots approach. And I think a lot of social change at a macro scale happens when like there is a collective tipping point where people wake up and if enough people wake up and say this is just not something that can be sustained anymore, we have to be outraged. That's not something that happens because you have a leader telling you to be outraged. Most people just are outraged, and then from that outrage, maybe a handful of leaders emerge to make the change that people are yearning for. Because it's a weird thing to say, but at an individual level, we all as individuals like won't be able to make the change we hope, but collectively we can. And part of that collective effort will be allocating some of our individual power to one or two people that have the responsibility to act on the will of the people. That's like what democracy is supposed to do. And so a leader will emerge, but I don't think it starts with a leader orchestrating this type of stuff. So And, figuring out how to make something sustainable, that's where it gets really complex. And that's the key thing. Because if you're making something good, you want to make it to last. Like if someone built you a house, and that house would only exist for a month, that'd be a nightmare of a house. That wouldn't even be called a house. If you want someone to build you a house, that thing needs to stand for like 100 years. Then you got a house, and that's how it works. But awesome. Well, I'm glad that was super helpful, Jackie. Thanks for tuning in. If you don't have any more questions, I think we're good. But the word of the week was Aufheben. It's a big important word, and it's a language to help people learn how to transcend their present environment and understand the dynamics of that transcendence, where like in so doing a part of you will go away, but like that will be beneficial. The bad parts ideally will go away and the good parts will stay, and then you'll become better than you were. And you can do that at a micro and a macro level. And so there you go. But thanks for tuning in. I really enjoyed this. And make sure you subscribe to The Word. Check out our stuff. I've written a lot of stuff about ethnocide this week and been on podcasts and all that kind of jazz. And so, go to our website, go to our Twitter, go to our IG, and check everything out. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.